There is no monarch in the long history of Georgia who has done more and is celebrated less than King George III. Under his watchful eye, he breathed new life into an empire that was being held together by a thread. His enemies would come to fear him in the same way that they had feared his grandfather. Many even ventured to give him the same moniker, a second coming of the Sword of the Messiah. George III Bagrationi was likely born sometime around 1115, although his real birth date eludes us. His father was King Demetrius, and his mother, like many early Georgian monarchs, is a mystery. He was the younger of two brothers, his older sibling being named David. He also had three younger sisters, of which we only know one of their names, and it was Rusidan. George III and his brother were born in the last 10 years of their grandfather's reign and likely share some memory of his grandeur, a memory that would serve both of them to action, although in dramatically different ways. The five-strong Bagrationi brood of Demetrius likely had somewhat of a privileged upbringing when compared to their predecessors. They were the first generation to really reap the benefits of empire, from birth and until death. At some point, Prince George was married off to Georgia's long-standing ally and more recent vassal, the Allans. An apparently beautiful daughter of King Kudan, named Bertacan, would become the prince's new wife. Growing up as a spare to the throne was not such a bad position. By all accounts, he and his elder brother David didn't seem to have a bad relationship at all. However, the same cannot be said of David and King Dimitri. In the 1140s, the spare became the heir. The circumstances are unknown, but Crown Prince David would be disinherited in some kind of dispute with his father. The younger George was now set to inherit the kingdom, with no spare of his own. This only served to anger David. In 1150, a coup led by the disgraced crown prince was discovered just in time for Demetrius to gloat at his son even further. There's no real description of what David was actually like as a person, but seeing as Demetrius couldn't get along with him, I assume he was not the most pleasant. Only 4 years later, David would try again, this time with the aid of those never ceasing to rebel Georgian nobles. He successfully overthrew King Dimitri, forced him to become a monk, changed his name to Damien, exiled him, kept George III as his temporary heir, made a baby, got poisoned, and then died. He only reigned for 6 months, having been betrayed by the same nobles who had betrayed Dimitri, who they now promptly called back to Tbilisi to just casually return as their king. He showed up shortly after, crowned his son George as co-king, as he had always intended, and returned to his faraway monastery in the east, leaving King George III as the head of state. This was confirmed completely when his father died shortly after returning to his humble church. But there was one immediate family problem that King George had to deal with, and an all too familiar one. The unborn child of the deceased King David V was born to be a rebel. King George III took measure, although not drastically. The young Denma was born a prince, but disinherited as his father had been, even while George had no children of his own. Denma's care was handed off to the Orbeli noble family, and he would be raised in the Georgian-Armenian borderlands. With no other claimant to the throne, the nobles now had no choice but to listen to King George III, something that would pay dividends during his many trials as king. Immediately after becoming the lone, solitary king, George ditched his father's plans of playing a defensive campaign. Instead of allowing invasion, he now dared to challenge the powers that be in the vacuum of the once formidable Seljuk Empire. A continuous and grogging war could be found directly in the southern borderlands. Shah Armenia wanted northern Armenia back, and it was simple as that. For the first time in decades, the Georgians mounted a proper invasion of Shah Armen, raiding the countryside, recruiting the locals, and creating a clear and defined border of scorched ground to repress any future ideas. The war for the Armenian marches would continue, but the stalemate had clearly settled in favor of Sakartvelo this time around. With one victory in Armenia, there always came another defeat, and the case would be no different this year. The Kurdish emir of Ani, who had been nothing but an ally to King Dmitri, Fakir, was murdered, as his father and two uncles had been before him. Succeeding him would be his brother, Fadel bin Mahmud. With both Dmitri and Fakir dead, the political winds in Ani shifted away from Georgia. The Cathedral of Ani was closed, and the yearly tax never showed up. Another war for Ani loomed just over the horizon. With the southern border settled, King George gathered his strength and bided his time, waiting for his turn to strike out against his neighbors. 4 years after ascending the throne, a much-needed miracle blessed the king and his country. A possible heir of his own flesh and blood was born in 1160. Although after this long wait it would prove to only leave more questions, as the beautiful Burdikan gave birth to a girl. Her name was Tamar. Georgia had never had a female ruler, excluding a long-dead Queen Dinar of Hereti. The pressure to produce a male heir would be lessened soon thereafter, as Queen Burdikan began showing the following year. And again, a daughter would be born, Princess Rusadan, the last child of King George III. With no tradition of female rulers, the push to reverse the young Denma's birthright disqualification from the throne persisted as a hot-button issue in the court. The hope for George to bear another child and the immediate threat of the Seljuk splinter states would push otherwise rebellious talks to the side for the time being. All could agree that George, despite his shortcomings in succession, was the man for the job at hand. Again, fortunes inside the ruined city of Ani continued rubber banding and snapping. The Armenian populace revolted, murdered their emir, and offered the city to King George, just as they had in the lifetime of his grandfather. With all reasonable sense, King George confirmed his rule over the city, and to appease the diverse population, he appointed a prominent Kurdish man to become the new governor, Sadun. This had worked to quell Tbilisi's initial rebellion upon conquest, and seemed a good enough compromise. But King George had been outright deceived, as Sadun immediately rejected Georgian vassalage and aligned himself with his nearby Islamic neighbors. The king sent an army led by his marshal and family babysitter, Ivan Orbeli. Easily, this general retook the plateau plains of the city and was rewarded with the governance of it. Now the man who controlled the army helped poison the previous king and was currently raising a disgruntled Bagrationi prince, was now the owner of the most elusive and betrayal-filled city that was Ani. Surely nothing could go wrong here. George was not a complete fool, however. He did place a checkmate on his favorite noble's new prize. Ivan Orbeli would split the governance of the city with the new force in the politics of Georgia. An Armenian by the name of Sargis Zakarian would become the first member of this otherwise minor noble family to hold any real power in the Kingdom of Georgia. Zakarian, or Mikardzeli? I don't know, you tell me. Translates to long-armed or long-shouldered. Perhaps a reference to the overall size of this family's members, or an ancestral affinity with the sword, the ultimate long arm. Either way, the Zakarians from this humble beginning would grow to embody this later hypothesis of their surname. As always, this reclamation of Ani would not go unchallenged. A coalition now gathered all around southwestern Georgia. The previously captured Saltuk II of the Saltukids, the Artukids, and Sokman II of Shah Armenia joined forces to face the resurgent Georgians. Little did they know that they were playing directly into the prepared hand of King George III. The war gates of the Caucasus were opened. All contestants in the region would come to claim a part in the upcoming and decade-long conflict that would come to define the reign of King George III. Where else would the coalition meet the Christians rather than the city of 1001 invasions that is now Ani? The southern forces reached the city before the main Georgian host led by their king arrived on scene to reinforce his two favorite Armenian nobles. But the trio of emirs would soon become only a duo. Saltuk II had already been captured and ransomed once by the Georgians for meddling in the affairs of Ani. That damn well was not gonna happen again, so he abandoned his allies and just left them for dead in enemy territory. So, now Sakmen and the descendants of Ilghazi in what was becoming a common sight were defeated and put on the run, even though they fought ferociously against a much smaller opponent. With the security of Ani confirmed for the time being, and the three smaller enemies running in fear or defeat, King George's plan to bait his enemies into conflict was so far paying off. Now it was time to lure the largest, newest, and most dangerous threat in the region, Atabeg Eldaguz. While holding the advantage, George pushed east from Ani and into Devin, taking the city, its valuables, and then returning, all in good fashion. Within a few months, the poster boy and puppet master of the old Seljuk Empire would meet the son of his rival. Eldaguz had already taken most of the eastern Georgian Empire from Dmitri. Now with this provocation, he would finish the job. From Shirvan, Eldaguz split his army in two and swept into Areti in the north, and got dangerously close to Tbilisi in the south. Fortunately for George, this is just what he was waiting for. Instead of confronting Eldaguz's army near Tbilisi, in a masterful move, the king took his army through Areti, pushing back the invasion there, and forcing it to join the southern force. This move allowed the Georgians to recapture Shirvan. George allowed his cousin Ag-Sartan to remain as his vassal lord. Having parried and now swung at his opponent, Eldaguz took his own jab in the south. Further south than Tbilisi, the Atabeg found more than willing contestants to join his war. After a short recovery, Sakmen II was always eager to fight the Georgians no matter what, so of course he joined Eldaguz. Not only this, but the undamaged army of Saltuk II, who had ran away, also joined this new coalition. With an even larger army to support him, they all hoped that their less competent counterpart from the west could actually be of some assistance this time. The coalition gathered just south of Ani. Marshal Ivan Orbeli and Governor Sargis Zakarian were left no choice but to gather their own much smaller army and confront their enemy before they even had a chance to reach their ruined city. It's safe to say that the two brave Armenian noblemen did not win the ensuing battle, but they did manage to escape with part of their army back to Ani. With George and the main army busy in Shirvan, Eldaguz and company marched on Gaji fortress that protected Ani from the north, and would cut off Georgian reinforcements. They captured and looted the castle. Hereafter, Ani became a no-man's land ruled by Turkish arrows and an outnumbered and undersupplied garrison. King George III was always one to strike where they least expected, and instead of marching into Armenia, he took a long and forced march across the whole of his empire before reaching the lands of Emir Saltuk II. If you pick on the weakest member, it's only a matter of time before this coalition turns into one-on-one. As expected, Saltuk returned to his lands in Erzurum. George III attacked him, and father-like son he defeated and imprisoned Saltuk. He then raided Erzurum and put the emir on ransom for the second time in his mediocre reign. The ransom would be paid by his sister, the wife of Sakmen II of Shah Armenia. Surely she paid much more than the measly 100,000 dinars he was first sold for. But the chroniclers never say. Still, George did not march to protect Ani. It had become his most important piece of decoy in his grand war plan. Again, he struck where the enemy least expected. Over the course of the year, King George marched back to the eastern Caucasus and started retaking the land Eldegoos had seized from his own father. Ganja was retaken, as was the land north and west of that city, nearly returning the borders of David IV in their entirety. After 3 years of back-and-forth warfare with no conclusive battlefield victories on either side, the Atabeg of Azerbaijan and the King of Georgia were exhausted. The former now was engaged in a war in Iran, while trouble was brewing to the north of Georgia. The peace terms were of mutual benefit. Both sides would keep the land they took, while Annie, that had somehow withstood the invasion, would again find itself split. Gone were governors Orbelian Zakarian. Here was Emir Mahmud, a relative likely brother or cousin of Eldegoos himself. Nominally, he would pay homage and tribute to King George III as one of his vassals, but his intentions obviously leaned with that of his family patriarch. Despite this messy situation, Emir Mahmud wasn't such a bad vassal. He paid his yearly tax and seemed to be the right type of level-headed man for such a compromise to be made. But at this point, I'm sure you have some idea just how fast the fragile peace on Annie can just fall apart. This armistice couldn't have come at a better time for King George. An unlikely rebellion sprung up in the east, centered around Dagestan, and led by the Emir of Derbent. As in the times of David IV, what was left of the independent nations in the North Caucasus banded together to oppose further Georgian encroachment on their lands, and in some cases, freedom from imperial vassalage. The strongest of these nations and peoples involved in this new coalition was of course the Emirate of Derbent, but through intrigue, alliance, and mercenaries, he comprised a proper army that could match that of Georgia. There was an old enemy, and sometimes ally of Georgia. The remnants of the Khazar Khaganate still clung onto the cliffs of the north-central Caucasus. That is resilience. Although fallen from glory, they were no pushover as missile cavalry still. Joining their Turkish brethren, as every army in the time and place fielded Cuman Kipchak mercenaries, so too would this one. Not only this, but some of these former nomads that were given citizenship in Georgia now joined the fray. More mercenaries came from Alania, much to the surprise of either side, as Georgia and Alania had stood mostly as friends for decades. And finally, entering more and more into the Georgian sphere of influence, there were men from the north. The Rus. At least we think. This specific tribe was likely the Brudnici. This name is close to a Slavic name which means to wander, meaning these men were nomads or at least semi-nomadic. Attempting to find a proper ethnicity for these people is run dry, but most would call them a conglomeration of 2 or more peoples. They were partly Slavic, and we know that for sure, meaning they were likely to some extent Rus, but also Romanian. There's probably some Turkish in there, likely Kipchak. But in all reality, they were basically the Cossacks of their day. There are no numbers for the size of the coalition army, but it held a dangerous core of cavalry, and that was threat enough for King George to personally march on the problem. But he could not get there fast enough before northern Shirvan was pillaged. His cousin, Ag Sartan, desperately called for an already approaching aid from his liege. The now battle-hardened George III utterly disassembled this much weaker coalition when compared to his southern foes. If there was a major battle, it was not recorded. What was told for generations was the utter devastation of Dagestan. George III repaid their raiding and showed no mercy to what seemed to be one of Georgia's most loyal vassals up until that point. In a turn of fortune, Shirvan would gain around half of their regional rival's emirate. A strong and loyal Shirvan was much more valuable than the same for Derbent. While this war came as a surprise, it seemed to be a much-needed evil to quell Shirvan with kindness. A much-debated figure appears in the previously stated campaign. A Byzantine prince by the name of Manuel Komnenos would join the Georgian army and show himself as a heroic fighter. While Manuel was in the east at this point, Byzantine sources only have him visiting as far as Jerusalem. However, a diplomatic mission to Byzantium's eastern powerhouse of an ally wouldn't be out of the question, as the Georgian Chronicles recount his trip to Tbilisi. The diplomatic trip would come to serve Manuel's two sons, Alexios and David, when the Komnenos family needed help the most. Georgia would be there for them. It's at this point where one of the greatest poets of all time, and certainly the most famous in the Caucasus at this point, gives a more than appealing description of George III. The writer in question goes by the pen name of Kakani. The son of a Muslim carpenter and converted Nestorian Christian, he had been the court poet for Manichor III of Shirvan since he was a teen. The critical Kakani appeared a fan of King George's brand of feudal rule. Quote, "A new Augustus, greater than Heracles, with no peer in the world, supreme defender of the cross, sword of the Messiah, reincarnation of Christ." Here, Kakani uses the moniker, sword of the Messiah, directly comparing George's greatness with the likeness of his grandfather David IV. And I say sure, why not? They were both pretty great. While he was no Augustus per se, at this point he was on top of the food chain in his corner of the world. He had beat all his neighbors fair and square, even as they teamed up against him. Referencing David IV yet again, George III was now prepared to rebuild Georgia from years of warfare. While David only had Georgia proper to repair, George III had to reform a whole empire. In the final and most prosperous days of David IV's reign, he revoked the church tax to minimal amounts. This he did to appease the ever-powerful clergy, and simply enough, he had more than enough money to deduct the expense. But things had changed in the last 30 years. George III was running out of money, as his war machine was no longer raiding its neighbors, collecting their wealth, and selling their people. The church tax was reinstated to fund the tired state. I'm sure the churchmen were not amused by this strategy, but it would pay off. Now, with the steadier income, George fixated his attention on rebuilding villages on the war-torn edges of the empire. The people of Shirvan, Derbent, Ganja, and practically all of Georgian-owned Armenia got a small respite from the chaos surrounding them. It is at this point where I will mention that George III, despite having none of his own, actually adopted a foster son named Chiaber. An orphaned boy, Chiaber would be the son George III never had. He joined the king's household, accompanied him on campaign, and even became a general. It's unclear when exactly the king adopted Chiaber, but by all accounts he was part of the family, sharing a particularly close bond with Princess Tamar. Chiaber appeared grateful for his most fortunate foster family. His loyalty could not be tested, for he only served the Bagrationi. In the midst of these quiet years, it became apparent that the nobles were eager to go back to war, if only to claim more glory and riches for themselves. Instead of looking outward for such glories, the aristocracy made war on the foreigners from within. In an honestly uncommon event in Georgian history, there appeared to have been a bit of an ethnic cleansing of the empire. This served to only weaken Georgia, as the population was only starting to recover from George's wars. And there went a large portion of the Turkish missile cavalry. However, the Kipchaks were mostly spared, for they were under the protection of the king. Finally, after 6 years of peace and, well, some population control, King George was ready to return to the saddle and restart the Aldeghuzid War. A rematch everyone saw coming would consume the Caucasus yet again. The army assembled in Armenia, and where do you think they struck from there? Not Annie. George struck at Devin, as he had long ago. He raided the land, reclaimed the Armenian church, and left a more sizable garrison there this time around. Meanwhile, Aldeghuz was currently in the east of his realm, defending against an attack from the up-and-coming Khwarezmian Empire. With only benefit from this war, the next year the army assembled in Armenia yet again. And where do you think they struck this time? No more gaslighting, it was Annie. Emir Mahmud would be ousted and sent into exile, and for the final time in his life, George III would retake Annie. Ivan Orbeli would become solo governor of the city, Sargis Zakarian not sharing the role this time around. And I'm sure, to the surprise of no one, just when Annie was reclaimed, it was nearly lost. Eldaguz was returning from the east. One man in particular was waiting for him. The Marshal, Governor of Annie, Master of Ceremonies, Protector of the Disinherited Denma, and quite possibly the second most powerful man in Georgia, Ivan Orbeli, crept his way out of the shadows, only to reveal a much darker side. Nearly as soon as he reoccupied Annie, he made talks to sell it to none other than Atabag Eldaguz. Of course, he took the deal and made preparations to retake it. When Ivan Orbeli informed the population, nearly the entire Armenian citizenry rallied by their clergymen and sent Orbeli and his entourage running back to their castles not far to the north. The bishop responsible for rallying the citizens was rewarded for his efforts. King George could find no loyalty in Annie, but what if he simply bought the loyalty? And he did this by means of ransoming the bishop's brother, Apparat. When he returned, he was granted the role as Emir of Annie. An Emir with a bishop brother, that's just the medieval Caucasus doing its regular normal thing. Even with Ivan Orbeli hunkered down, Eldaguz continued his planned invasion in the following year of 1175. He skipped over Annie, as per custom, and targeted the Armenian-Georgian borderland. Two armies struck, one at Lori, the other at Dmanisi. Both were repelled by King George. However, the armies did regroup. Combining their numbers, they overran Devin. George III did not pursue this conquest in any vigor. Devin appeared a pawn in the event of a war with Eldaguz. After 40 years of a reign mostly spent harassing two generations of Bagrationi kings, Islam's face in the Caucasus died an old man shortly after taking Devin. Starting life as a Kipchak slave, I'd say he fared pretty well considering the circumstances. His son and successor, Muhammad Jahan Pahlavi, would never live up to his father's legacy, but he was no pushover and would prove a worthy roadblock in Georgian ambitions. With his arch-nemesis dead and the others defeated, George III had given himself a rare opportunity, one David IV did not even get the luxury to enjoy in full. After a reign filled with war, George could shift his full attention to the arts, education, law, infrastructure, and various other forms of prestigious statecraft. It's at this point where Georgian poetry and literature finds some of its greatest prodigies. Among these are Shata Rustaveli, made immortal for the knight in the panther's skin, a medieval epic following a man named Cyril, chock full of war and enough Arthurian romance to go around. This book is not only just a story, but also a fantasy based on the world and the country he called home, a sort of contemporary alternate history, if you will. King George, under the disguise of King Rostavan, is the first mentioned person, and the second is Tamar. There is also to mention names like Chakrukadze, Moses Kaneli, Shavteli. While most of these penmans would get a start in George's empire, they would not produce their greatest works in his lifetime. The Caucasus Mountains were a hotbed for slave trading throughout history. Their men ferocious and their women beautiful. The kings of Georgia were definitely no exception to this reality. This always attracted slave trading bandits to entrench themselves within the countryside. George III went a bit draconian to get rid of them. Brutal efficiency called for the death penalty for any and all forms of thievery. The perpetrators would be hanged, and their loot hanged directly beside them. As you can imagine, this worked pretty well in deterring crime. After spending the better part of 3 years plotting after his bad departure from Annie, Ivan Orbeli had sowed the seeds of rebellion. Many nobles, including the man he had previously shared the governance of Annie with, Sargis Zakarian, chose to support Ivan Orbeli and the claimant to the throne King George had given to Orbeli as one of his first acts as king. The now 21-year-old Denma Bagrationi was his key to the Georgian Empire. On top of this, the Saltikids in Shah Armenia were also ready to join the war on the side of the pretender. Altogether, and likely exaggerated, 30,000 men somehow covertly marched to depose King George III. Maybe like 3,000, but the Georgian Chronicles prove an elusive beast with numbers. George III, like many of his predecessors, was a very pious man. He made it a frequent occasion to travel to various religious sites in his lands simply to pray. One night, in 1177, a few miles south from Tbilisi, King George found himself at such a site in the village of Kajori. As per usual, the king was accompanied by much of the Monaspa Guard. However, in the outskirts of the capital, the king's train of men was a tad shorter. They had no idea that the rebels were nearing this same village. When mysterious men, separate from the king's retinue, entered the settlement, a small boy took notice. Soon he overheard them whispering about taking the king. The boy acted, informed the Monaspa Guard, and quite possibly saved his liege's life. George and his escort galloped full heel the 12 miles to Tbilisi, and arrived before the insurrection could follow. From here, George set his guard and garrison on high alert, notifying his nobles and demanding that they remain loyal and send him their war bands. With their plot having been discovered, many of the co-conspirators switched sides and returned to their king's allegiance, among them being Zakarian, and all the Islamic nations, his most powerful allies, had abandoned him before a battle. With this, King George had the pleasure of marching on a man who once seemed so loyal. The rebels held up in Lori. A siege began and continued for months before peace talks were held. Ivan Orbeli, a man who held exactly 0 playing cards, actually demanded that George split the kingdom in half and give it to him. I can only imagine that this got a good laugh. Still, George did not want to kill his own countrymen if he didn't have to. Orbeli refused further peace talks, so the king simply attached peace decrees to arrows and shot them over the castle walls. A response was never shot back. Is that medieval texting? After a few more months, with the city starved into submission, a group of mountaineer mercenaries from Lesghan country scaled the walls and opened the gates. During the fall of the city, the young Denma walked out of the main gate and presented himself to the soldiers as a captive, a rope already tied around his neck. His actual involvement in the rebellion headed by his caretaker are unknown, but his punishment would be what I like to call a full royal service. To prevent any future attempts to the throne from him or his children, Denma was blinded, and immediately after that, castrated. He died during one of these surgeries. Ivan Orbeli would have his eyes gouged out and would spend the rest of his days in jail. The Orbeli family was killed or fled into exile, and their name was declared illegal. Many other rebels who never found their way to the king's side also met death or exile, clearing the way for a new, more loyal, and grateful class of nobility. To replace Ivan Orbeli in his role as Master of Ceremonies and Marshal of the Army would be the leader of the Monaspa Guard. A Kipchak warrior by the name of Kubasar was the right man for the job. In a strange twist, he also received nearly all of the Orbeli fief. A proper Kipchak noble now found its home in Georgia. Still, the Kipchaks found another role with Kudulu Arslan, becoming head of the treasury. Appointing Kipchaks as a new ruling elite was a move to facilitate trust in his highest offices, and it did work effectively for many years. But just how long would the Georgian nobles be happy with this? Sargis Zakarian was given many lands in Armenia, becoming the de facto governor of the region. Among these new appointments, the most shocking was in the wealthy and ancient city of Kartli. George III seemingly picked a peasant off the street and made him a Grand Duke. Apradon was forever in debt to the Bagrationi and remained loyal. To ease the church, King George lifted the tax he had instated on them nearly a decade ago. He also appointed a warrior monk that wielded no weapons, named Anton, to the position of Chancellor. The 1177 rebellion forced George to face the only blemish on his legacy. With no sons, the succession was still up for debate, but King George allowed no more questions. Gender to the side, his firstborn daughter, Tamar, would be the next ruler of Georgia, even if that meant she had to become a Mepe now. In the ancient cliffside town of Uplisiki, with houses built into cave systems that had been inhabited since the Iron Age, and now featured chapels and churches, is where you can find King George III, placing a separate yet similar and smaller crown when compared to his own on the top of Tamar's head. Tamar Mepe's long and prosperous reign would start with her sharing power with her father. With no male Bagrationi within eyesight, the deep-seated aristocracy who remained dared not question the king who had just deleted their friends. And for the years these two monoliths in Georgian history reigned side by side, a grand peace came along with it. In Vardsey Monastery, the co-reign comes to life. A fresco remains of the two monarchs standing side by side. Surprisingly well preserved, we can make out both of their features. The co-rulers pressed even harder on punishing banditry, having thieves hanged alongside their goods in the usual fashion. When that problem was sorted out, the two rulers went on a rat extermination frenzy, which is good, but they could have just bought some cats. Georgia, similar to today, was home to many stray dogs. And I think you see where I'm going with this. Yeah, they exterminated the dogs as well, which is good, but dogs, they're cool. At the tail end of George's reign, I think it's time we take a look at his coins. They feature a crisscross George holding a bird, much like Seljuk coins. And on the back, there's Arabic script. There's really not another coin, at least from Georgia, quite like this. With his succession assured, his enemies defeated or outlived, his pests, human or not, exterminated, and his nobility quelled, King George III lived out his twilight years in relative comfort, and I'd say that was pretty well earned on his part, which likely attributed to his old age, at least for Bagrationi standards. When the king died on March 27th of 1184, he was likely around 70 years old. He was buried at Gelati Monastery, among his most famous ancestors. George III is yet another example of a military prodigy coming out of the Bagrationi line. Where David was the Seljuk slayer, George was the coalition crusher. And yes, while he was no David on the battlefield, his domestic policies might just trump that of his grandfathers. King George III, like his father Demetrius, is usually eclipsed by the reigns of those who came before and after, that being David IV and Tamar Mepe. George III should be remembered as the man who stabilized the Georgian Empire from David's rapidly formed and overextended realm into Georgia's greatest golden age during the reign of his daughter Tamar. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And join Derek Clark, Savaclio Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nick Mate Vossian, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J. Dalinar, and Moist Lord. Or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent. What? Why? Nick Mate Vossian again, G.O.D., Heath Hothead 9, Dion, Carl Cleric 61 Brandian, and G.O.K. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it.